Standing by. Who's there? Oh, Mark. Good morning.
Well, good morning, Mike. The polls are open in Illinois this morning.
On North End Road, as well as the defective traffic lights in Knightsbridge. Traffic's also heavy on the Upper Richmond Road.
Un cordiale saluto da Giuseppe Liani in studio per questa seconda edizione del giornale Radio 3. Ecco i titoli delle principali.
Quindi se volete farvi una bella vacanza, ecco qui la casa per voi.
1. The baptism of Christ. 2. The polyptych of the Misericordia. 3. The penance of St. Jerome. 4. St. Jerome and Adona. 5. St. Sigismund and Sigismondo Malatesta. 6. Sigismondo Malatesta. 7. The Arezzo cycle. 8. The Madonna del Parto. 9. St. Julian. 10. The Resurrection. 11. Mary Magdalene. 12. The Flagellation. 13. The Polyptych of St. Anthony. 14. The Polyptych of St. Augustinian. 15. Hercules. 16. The Duke and Duchess of Urbino. 17. The Madonna of Senegalia. 18. The Madonna and Child with Angels. 19. The Nativity. 20. The Madonna and Child with Saints.
And these are more of the Arezzo frescoes, corrected against the transparency, which is not great.
No, also the conditions of the painting are not so good, satisfactory.
You've got to believe, but apart from the Arezzo paintings, there are only 20 or so works by him that still survive.
If there any person I'd like to have been, I think Piero would have been one of them, or possibly the only one.
He is almost my favorite painter. I think it's very difficult, it's very mysterious to discover what the effect of him is. I think it must be due to the fact that he was a mathematician and a geometrician, and there's something extraordinarily peaceful about the space in the pictures.
Primarily his intellect. He's beautiful, startling, surprising, and very, very profound. The combination is without parallel.
For someone like myself who has a taste for this marriage of high intellectual analysis with sensuous rapture, I think he's as good as they get.
When you think that the great Piero De La Francescas aren't much bigger than an average TV screen, and this single image, whereas probably in the last minute you've seen something like 2,500 images, this single image still commands your attention for 500 years. Pretty amazing feat, isn't it?
As you turn into this room, we see the works of Piero De La Francesca, active 1439, died 1492. Italian painter who worked outside Florence for the whole of his career as an independent artist. we hear of him at various times in Borgo San Sepolcro, his hometown, Ferrara, Rimini, Arezzo, Rome, and Urbino. But he found the origins of his style in Florence, and we may take it as certain that he lived there as a young man for some time during the 1430s, although the surviving documents only record that he was with Domenico Veneziano in 1439. For centuries largely forgotten, Piero's idealized geometrical forms have captured the imagination of the 20th century.
Frescoes by Piero De La Francesca. Is a cycle of frescoes.
He had studied and absorbed the great artistic discoveries of his Florentine predecessors and contemporaries, Masaccio, Donatello, Domenico Veneziano, Fra Filippo Lippi, Uccello. Piero's lucid intelligence was complemented by a unique feeling for the cool, crystalline daylight which envelops the Tuscan landscape.
He was, as a painter, simply as a painter, an executant, a man of extraordinary sensibility, who was capable of receiving impressions of light of a subtlety which no artist, I think, had ever received before. And not only that, was capable of transmitting them in paint. So that when you look, for example, at the Baptism of Christ in London, one sees this marvelous crystalline quality of atmosphere, and that is something which is peculiar to Piero.
The painting of the Baptism is probably the most structured landscape we could think of. It's not a simple narrative, and it also has a very strange atmosphere. It's extremely bright, clear, there are clouds, there is a stillness, there's a peace, and at the same time there is something that makes you tingle all over, something that really gives you a kind of a sense of an electric charge. So you are challenged into trying to put these two things together. How can something be peaceful and calm and at the same time really stimulating in a spiritual way?
Io sto guardando un fiume e questo fiume si è miracolosamente arrestato davanti a me. L'acqua del fiume non mi arriva più. Io sono all'asciutto, ma assisto a un istante perché fra un po' l'acqua continuerà a scorrere. Gli angeli stanno appena per cantare. L'acqua dalla ciotola che San Giovanni sta versando sul capo del battesimo di Gesù sta appena per scendere. Quindi io ho un lampo, ho un momento, ho una specie di trasfigurazione. Sono ammesso a una visione.
It's a very still picture. I mean, the water is still. But the one, apart from these hands, the one really important piece of movement in the painting is the teeny trickle of water that falls from the bowl which the Baptist holds above Christ's head. And at that same moment, there's a sort of very a distinct rainfall of gold light and the appearance of the dove above. Again, as you know, as we notice with the repetition of the hand, so it's very striking that Piero rather likes the idea of, as it were, rhyming the dove, which he's been very careful to foreshorten, to rhyme the dove with these cloud shapes nearby.
There's the stable background of mathematics behind, and geometry, behind these paintings, which is accountable really for their really irresistible appeal, for the effect that they make on the ordinary spectator. Almost all we know about the structure of Piero's work is due to Professor Carter. His work really, I think, is beyond praise.
I first got interested in the baptism when my students asked me to talk to them about the uses of geometry in pictorial composition. And I took some paintings that they well knew in the National Gallery and started to analyze the photographs. And that brought me to Piero, where the geometrical substructure seemed partly fairly obvious. For example, the dove, which is stretched out wings, is sort of inviting one to draw a line across the part of the panel there. And if you take that line and swing it down, you find that it meets in a point on the tip of Christ's toe, making an equilateral triangle. And then thinking in geometrical terms, I said, well, let's put a circle round it and find its center. And that turned out to be just at the tip of Christ's praying fingers. And then I remembered a proposition in Euclid's Elements of Geometry, which involves a circle, a triangle, and a superimposed regular pentagon. The equilateral triangle, obviously here, it symbolizes the descent of the Holy Spirit. The circle is God always, Christ and God. The regular pentagon, the 5 wounds of Christ. Kenneth Clark first said that it's perfectly obvious that this panel is divided into 3 horizontally and divided into 4 vertically. And he also said that it seems that the central element of the design is an implied triangle made by running up the sides of Christ's upper arms to a point in the dove. When I measured that angle, and I found that it was 36 degrees. Now that was very significant, because the 36-degree isosceles triangle is a triangle which has its base making a golden section with the sides. In a golden section, that piece A and that piece B, when A is to B, as B is to A plus B. I hope when people know about some of these geometrical configurations, that when they notice them in the baptism, it won't disturb the pleasure they get from the picture aesthetically. But there's no doubt about it that Christ's body does fit very neatly into the Pythagorean star, the 5-pointed star. And you can't help seeing that when you know. In Piero's day, there was this tremendous revival of interest in Plato. They called themselves the Neoplatonists, you know, who tried to find symbols in everything. The more the better, this sort of stuff. Those in the know, that's the point. These secrets had to be kept hidden in knots and riddles. They didn't want the common herd to know about them. Funny game. It's a long tradition, this tradition of secrecy. It goes back to the beginning of Christianity, virtually. In the beginning, the world was without order and measure, according to Plato, just like Genesis. And out of this disorder, God began to bring order by forming these little particles. God used the most beautiful forms, which were the most symmetrical ones to Plato. It seems that Piero naturally thought and felt in terms of geometrical figures and numbers. He was an absolute mathematical freak almost. He could deal with numbers in a most extraordinary way, just as though he had a computer in his head. Later on, he wrote his treatise on perspective, which is very thoroughgoing.
De Prospectiva Pingendi, the book on the perspective of painting, is immensely illuminating in that it shows us how he did perspective with enormous careful elaboration. He uses two different techniques, but one of them involves taking a form and tracing the light rays back to a point from every point on the form, and then, as it were, cutting through this, which then makes the picture. Therefore, if I was drawing a head, I would trace all the rays from the head, from all these points on the head, which he marks in, into this single point, which is in your eye, in theory, and then cut it through. And the cutting through of all these light rays would make the picture, and he tells you how to do that.
What date? What date is this?
This is about 1470.
I mean, that's remarkable, because I mean there are diagrams very similar to this you might find in a computer publication that was published in the last few years, where people have taken coordinates from a head or any other object for that matter, and used that to produce a computer 3D model.
He's doing something which computers can do very readily if you've got the right program. Now, he does it all by hand, step by step. Now, that needs three things. It needs a grasp of geometry to know what you're doing. It needs quite incredible patience, because it takes a long time. But it also requires a tremendous spatial vision, because you can lose your way. He ends up with a mass of points, and he needs to know what each of these points represents. Now, somehow or other, he was able to keep in his mind all this forest of lines. He also needs this ability to see flat geometry in 3 dimensions.
Now we've got 4 different views. Top view, front view, and a side view. Should be the same.
Yes, and you can see it being built up in perspective here.
Because this, of course, is the purpose of the whole thing from Piero's point of view.
An obvious question, did he really do this in his paintings? Is this like 5-finger exercises on a piano, the sort of thing you do, but you don't actually parade in public? I think in Piero's case, he did actually use these techniques. Not for everything in a painting. If he painted a tree in the background, he could do that relatively freehand. But when he had to do a head, particularly a head tilted back, in the Resurrection, there's a head tilted back. Now, I think he did that geometrically. I think rather than just looking to see how it worked, I think he took a tilted back head and he did the full projection, tracing all the optical lines, which must have taken a long time.
It's tipping forward, it's coming up to face you, and then it's turning to the side. And then there's the tipped view of the soldier in the Resurrection.
The real question about Piero is, where did he get his education? Now, I don't mean the painting education, I mean his mathematical education. If he really was from a relatively small town, Borgo San Sepolcro was a teensy town at that point. And we have no evidence that he ever went to university. There's no documentary evidence of any formal education. And yet, he has been called the most important mathematician of the 15th century by Marshall Clagett, who is the major historian of science. And to do this, you have to know Euclid, you have to know a lot about math, and you have to know Latin. And we don't know where Piero learned any of that.
The short answer is we have no idea at all how he got this mathematical education. It could have been self-learnt, but I think some foundations must have been laid down. Relatively early in his career, the first book he wrote was about abacus mathematics, which is simple, practical mathematics, though he's already interested in geometry. But he must, I think, have had some kind of basic education which was more than an artist would expect. You know, if you're apprenticed when you're 12, you probably were just about literate, you would have no Latin. You would have perhaps an ability to add up a few sums in order to keep your account straight, but you wouldn't really have the sort of mathematical background I suspect that Piero had.
Although Vasari says he was the son of a shoemaker and a tanner, those are his words. And you would think Vasari ought to know because he came from Arezzo. This really doesn't seem to be possible because no son of a tanner would be studying Latin or Euclid. And then there is a house in Borgo San Sepolcro, which is known as Piero's house. If this really was Piero's family house, it was very palatial.
There is some reason to suppose that he was quite well off, you know, sort of gent. And that meant that he wasn't actually obliged to produce some work on time or anything like that, you know, because I mean he did take a long time, quite a spectacularly long time over some of these pictures. But it's interesting that he could afford to do that.
Questo legame, questo attaccamento è testimoniato anche dalle cariche che Piero della Francesca ha ricoperto qui nella nostra città. Cariche spesse volte molto modeste. Siamo nella sala più importante del Museo Civico di San Sepolcro, la sala che custodisce le opere di Piero della Francesca. In primo luogo la Resurrezione, dipinta su questa parete da Piero, in quanto in questa sala si riuniva il consiglio della città e Piero stesso è stato uno dei 24 consiglieri. Ecco, è stata dipinta sulla sala perché fosse un po' il simbolo e l'emblema della città. Dall'altro lato abbiamo la Madonna della Misericordia, che è un'opera, possiamo dire, singolare, fino dalla sua commissione, in quanto i confratelli della Misericordia dettarono delle regole ben precise sia per quanto riguardava il materiale che doveva usare, sia per gli stessi colori. Fu commissionata nel 1445, ma consegnata definitivamente nel 1460.
There are a few young people now who have been working in the archives in Arezzo and Borgo San Sepolcro who have unearthed a number of documents and have rolled back Piero's painting career a number of years. He was working with an artist from Anghiari in the early 30s, so he was already training at that point. That means that he had some kind of foundation before he went to Florence. There's only one document about Piero in Florence in 1438 when he apparently was working with Domenico Veneziano. Piero probably wasn't a maestro at that point, but it's hard to say since we don't know when he was born.
It was a time when really the visual revolution was being forged. Just sensational. Masaccio had been active the previous decade. He had died tragically young at the age of 27, 28, but his works were there to be seen. Brunelleschi, the great architect, was building the dome of Florence Cathedral. Brunelleschi was the inventor of perspective. Alberti in 1435 had written his book on perspective. It was a most amazing time.
When Piero first came to Florence in the 30s, he will have seen this extraordinary fresco by Masaccio. It's about 16 feet high. It has life-size figures. It is a trompe-l'oeil representation of a chapel. Now, this is the first great painting done in scientific perspective. And I think that Piero must have thought something was going on, something mysterious going on.
The key for perspective, as people used to be taught at school, was the vanishing point, which wasn't a term known in the Renaissance, but it's the term we now use, and that's the point towards which all parallel lines which go straight back into the picture, technically perpendicular to the picture plane, but you can imagine them like railway lines or like the lines of a road with telegraph poles down the side of it. Now, if you take those lines going straight back, although we know they go parallel, they look as if they're all going to this single point. That's what's known as the vanishing point, and that is the key, really, to perspectival representation. From the first, Piero was very interested in clear structures in paintings, but what this vision he got in Florence, this vision of a mathematical ordering of space, gave him was an ability to turn that into something precise, something he could control. And he was in love with vision, he was in love with seeing things, but that wasn't enough for him. He had to say, how does this work? How can I reconstruct this visual delight on a systematic, rational basis?
It's a bit of a pity, I think, nowadays that artists and scientists don't meet and talk very often. I don't know many artists who do involve themselves so completely, mainly because it's just so difficult to engage with that world. Its vocabulary has got so distant from us, and we do not live in a court. You know, Piero lived in a court where everybody that was important met and talked, probably over dinner. They were all hirelings, after all, and so around a table, just as in an Oxford high table, but slightly more active, perhaps. You've got all these people talking, and geographers, historians, and scientists would talk to each other. There's no such forum now.
Urbino, I think, was the perfect place for Piero De La Francesca. It was the perfect place because it's just such a marvellous Renaissance city, and anyone with his visual sensitivity must have felt at home. But I think it's more importantly there's the patronage. Federico da Montefeltro, who was the Marquis of Urbino, became Duke of Urbino during the course of a very spectacular career. A military man, but a man in love with books, a man in love with art. And as he established his wealth through soldiery, so he devoted this wealth to the arts, to the great palace, to the decoration of the palace, to the patronage of humanists and so on. I think you had an artist and patron, they came together and I think it was a perfect marriage in a way. The interests and the education of the artist, the interest of the education of the patron, absolutely married.
Piero was on an even intellectual level with both Sigismondo Malatesta and Federico da Montefeltro, these remarkable guys who were out leading armies and throwing their spears around and creating noisy, clangorous battles here and there, and at the same time were discovering the great joys of intellectual life and amassing marvelous libraries and beautiful palaces and paintings.
The evidence about the end of Piero's career is problematic, like almost everything in his career. The stories by later writers are that his sight failed and that the later part of his career was perhaps not terribly happy, or that he turned to mathematics. I don't think the book De Prospettiva Pingendi, the book on the perspective of painting, is written by an artist with impaired sight.
No, he didn't stop painting. First of all, he wrote his will in '87, and he said he was of sound mind and body, and I think legally you can't be blind and say that. So if he went, he probably did go blind. There was a young man who said that he had led him around, but I don't think he went blind much before '87 or '88, and he died in '92, so it wasn't all that long.
È il registro dei morti della Fraternità di San Bartolomeo dal 1460 al 1519. Contiene una delle poche date certe su Piero della Francesca. È l'annotazione della morte di Piero della Francesca, il 12 ottobre del 1492. Ecco, noi lo troviamo mese di ottobre del 1492, è annotata Maestro Piero di Benedetto di Francesco, pittore famoso, AD 12, Abbadia è l'antica chiesa abbaziale di San Sepolcro dove è sepolto Piero della Francesca.
I think the truth is that Piero lost his station very rapidly. When Raphael was called to paint the Vatican stanze, there had been a cycle of frescoes there, which by Piero, which he simply painted over. There are few documents about the baptism, for example, are in the 16th and 17th century, and by 75 years after Piero was dead, it's lying in the back room with a cloth over it, so it wasn't functioning anymore. He was much better known as a mathematician. It's really his rediscovery that has made him what we think of today as a famous painter. And he was, more or less, he was rediscovered because he looks so modern.
The whole tendency towards analysis of space in geometrical terms, even cubism to a degree, though cubism is fractures space rather than makes it. This sort of way of analysing space, thinking about picture making, suddenly became very relevant again. Vermeer was discovered about the same time, and I think it's no coincidence that these two supreme rational describers of light in space were both discovered about the same time. He's very much in tune with the 20th century.
Buongiorno da Mauro Massa, studio per la pagina politica. E cosa pone giusta tirare le somme? Lo dice il presidente Scalfaro ai suoi interlocutori, lo pensa l'opinione pubblica.
I think he's the best if there's a competition running. You know, I think he's the best painter I know.
I'd like Piero to be sort of more private now. I hate all this. Now I'm contributing towards it. Say once a fortnight or once a month. I always come and have a look.
And I'm very lucky to be here near Arezzo, I think. It's been a year or so, 18 months that they've been working. They're trying to prevent further damage occurring to the frescoes, I suppose. I mean, we can't restore them, we can't touch them up, but at least they can stop the rot, perhaps, let's hope. Thank goodness they're only doing half at a time. At least we can see the other half for a while. Right at the top we've got Adam. Here's the death of Adam, the Queen of Sheba. And then we've got the battle. Yeah. The Pontinulia, yes. Then the bearing of the cross, of the wood, before it was a cross, of course. And then below this, the one I'm looking at now, the Dream of Constantine. It's symbolic for Constantine's conversion, you might say, to Christianity. And so he was asked by the angel to, or suggested, that in the name of this cross he would win. And the picture shows Constantine dreaming this, and it shows so graphically the angel's dramatic form coming down, the most extraordinary light. As a piece of painting, when you think when it was done, 52 or something like that, it is extraordinary that it has such a feeling of mystery and light, unknown, I would say, in painting until this time. It's also extraordinary that it should be painted at a time when Constantinople itself was about to fall and was threatened. For Piero, that must have been a dreadful threat. So there's a real urgency, I imagine, about the painting.
This is a very nice view. It's as though you were coming in from the side of the church where the door is and progressing down the nave and go into the apse area. We are able to rise up in a free area of space that even Piero didn't have, without scaffolding, without a dolly, without a boom, without all kinds of interference, and we were able to make comparisons and make analyses that have not been possible before.
As we move in, you see the pictures look a little bit blurry, but when we stop motion, we get a nice clear set of images on the screen. If I pull the space ball back towards me, we actually move in towards the scene. It's like I'm pulling the object towards me.
Really gives you a sense of being in the space, helping you understand where you are. I wonder what Piero would have thought if he'd seen this moving about and these angles. I think it would have made him really happy.
If you can understand the story of the Arezzo frescoes after you've read it, I can't. I mean, you know, you can read it endlessly. It is extraordinarily difficult to understand about this bit of the True Cross and where it went to and how it came about, and the dream of Constantine. I'm not sure you'd enjoy the pictures very much more when you know what the story is. The frescoes in Arezzo are the centre of Piero's career and have been considered his chief claim to immortality. Although she had done her best to prepare herself for Arezzo, Molly still had difficulty in making out the story. Things were not made easier by the fact that the frescoes were only illuminated when someone put money into a machine, and so were often plunged into sudden darkness, like Hugh's old bed-sitter when the meter ran up. In many places, the paint had faded, leaving naked stretches of wall, blotting out half a battle, the legs of a torturer, or a woman's face. And then as the lights came on and the walls were lit up with sky blue and stone grey, the green of grapes and olives, the pale red of wine held up to the light, she saw the round, invariably handsome, always unsmiling faces, with eyelids that seemed heavy as stone, looking down with perpetual detachment and even, in the case of the women, a kind of contempt. Not 10 o'clock yet, and we've done Arezzo. Connie Tapscott looked at her watch with deep satisfaction. It won't take us long to knock off the pregnant Madonna. The pregnant Madonna in Montecchi is enormously moving for where it is. I mean, it's in a field, and someone finds you a key, and you open that little chapel, and there is this actually pregnant woman, which with the Madonna is very rarely painted as being pregnant, and it is extraordinarily moving.
They were fairly remote parts of Italy, as you must know. I mean, where some of the most important of the pictures are. And they are, even now, they're a bit off. Tourists congratulate themselves a bit when they get there. But in those days, 50 years ago, a tremendous amount of self-congratulation of discovering all these things, and sort of an old woman with a key opening a door, and they suddenly saw this marvellous thing. You know, the sense of pilgrimage, which was very important. You felt that, you know, this was a special artist who was slightly off the beaten track, and off also the main roads of European artists as it had been taught.
The Piero De La Francescas are the best thing. Start with the murals in Arezzo, then you can do Montecchi and San Sepolcro. If you're feeling very adventurous, I'd advise you to take the trail over the mountains of the moon to Urbino. See what's probably the greatest small painting in the world. What's the greatest painting? Another Piero, the Flagellation. Sounds a bit kinky. It's a mystery, Molly told them. No one can quite explain it. That's why it's so marvelous.
we're going to see the flagellation, but it's not just the flagellation that's important, it's seeing the painting in its situation of the ducal palace. And I think that that relationship is very important. I've read all the books, and there are so many books theorizing on Piero. I understand the geometry and I've analyzed the paintings geometrically, but nothing can replace standing in front of the paint. The sheer presence of the artist is with you over 500 years. The 500 years don't matter. It could have been painted yesterday, or it could still be in the process of being painted.
The flagellation is a mystery. I mean, nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows who those three people conspiring together whilst the flagellation goes on in the background, who they are or what they're cooking up, so that it is an endlessly intriguing mystery.
If you look at the flagellation, you have a very strange picture indeed, in that it is a picture that is divided into two. I don't think that exists. I don't know of any other picture that does that. And where the subject of the flagellation, whether people are now saying that it is not the flagellation but it's a dream or something, but irrespective of that, there's no centre to the picture. You don't really know who the three people on the right are. And it's a violent action, and that how the violent action is very calm.
It is, in a way, an almost perfect pictorial creation, with this meticulous care, and at the same time a very remarkable play with content, that the space becomes a vehicle for this very extraordinary scene, which hasn't been, I think, fully understood even now. The great work on the initial unravelling of the perspective was done by Wittkover and Carter, who first deprojected the work, as it were, and they also had the first systematic go at getting out the very complex tile pattern.
By doing his perspective in reverse, one is able to make an actual ground plan of this judgment hall where Christ is. First of all, it's not certain what shape Christ is standing on until you discover through your plan that he's standing on a dark circle in a square. The circle is a symbol of God, of Christ, and the square of the earth. There are two big squares outside the judgment hall. That's in the here and now part of the picture. Now you move into the visionary part of the picture, Christ in the judgment hall, and your square motif is broken up by this strange pattern. And then you move to the Christ circle and the strange pattern again. The meaning of all this, I think, is that we move in from the earth squares outside the judgment hall into the presence of Christ. In fact, you could say that the square and the circle theme symbolizes a reconciliation between heaven and earth. And the next question might be, how does one construct this pattern? What's the key to it? Well, the key turns out to be take a golden section of the radius of this Christ circle and use it to measure some of these little squares. I think the appreciation of the painting is, one doesn't need to know anything about this. When you look at the painting, You do wonder what's going on that floor, because Piero doesn't tell you. Not only is it not apparent, it's meant to be hidden, because there's such a low angle of vision, you can't see what you're looking at. It's the old tradition of secrecy. Don't let the hoi polloi know your secrets, because they'll just vulgarize them. People who paid him let into it. It's a secret. It's a lovely secret. No one's allowed to know except those who are in the know.
It was in a course where I saw the drawings by B.A.R. Carter, in which they reconstructed the space in the flagellation. And I remember saying, oh my goodness, is that where those figures are standing in that painting? That painting must be very, very deep. And it was the first time I'd ever realized that a painting could have a sense of reality that was its own kind of reality, a pictorial reality.
I've worked from a reproduction of the painting itself and then worked out where each point, each element in the space of the picture must be by taking lines from the theoretical viewpoint through the picture, as it were, which is on this surface here, where my hands are, finding out the depth of each point and object in the scene. It's really come out pretty well. What do you think, Martin?
Well, I'm pleased but not surprised. It's a wonderful verification of what we guessed about Piero from his writings and from other analyses of his pictures. And most artists, you could do some sort of model if they're doing perspective pictures, but they begin to fall apart and there are all sorts of ambiguities. Right. There are very few artists and very few pictures you could do that to and come up with that precise result.
That's right. I think people looking casually at the picture wouldn't appreciate the distance of those very tall, thin towers. These figures are masking really very large areas of these big buildings because you're so close to them, your viewpoint that you've got the camera there is very, very close, and they're filling the whole of that right-hand half of the picture.
That makes you realise how fantastically deep that space is.
That's right.
What I think is remarkable, Philip, is the way in which from this sort of angle you don't get much sense of coherence in this floor pattern at all, do you?
In fact, it's a cunning pattern of large and smaller squares, and the fact that some of the squares are set on the diagonal means that you get this √2 proportion coming out in the pattern.
Right, that's what hasn't always been realised, is that the diagonal of that square actually provides the side length of that square and throughout the design, which of course can't be done with arithmetic, can it? It's,
no,
it's
irrational proportion, that's right.
Yeah. And then in the centre, then we've got Christ and the flagellation occurring in this very simple, compared with this immensely complicated system. You've then got Christ and the flagellation occurring in this perfect circle.
Circle pattern, yes. Yeah. He's the middle of it.
And he's obviously planned this front bit with absolutely meticulous precision. I mean, the whole thing is worked out as architecture, isn't it?
It must have been done from measured drawings, architectural drawings, in fact, yes.
The perspective is right, so he ought to go back to the same height as the figures in the background.
Yes, so here's my second copy of him.
Yeah.
And then we can compare him with, say, this figure here.
Yeah, perfect. Yep.
And against Christ as well.
Yep.
Yes, the flagellator is on the left as the tallest mantle.
Yeah. I mean, it all shows this extraordinary precision, doesn't it?
That's right, yes.
Something dramatic happened to the painting in the 50s. It underwent one of the first modern restorations. What was revealed was that the underneath part of the portico had 3 large rectangular segments, the center one of which is brilliantly illuminated, whereas the one in the front, the one in the back, are much less bright. Well, this center area corresponds to exactly where Christ is standing. And seeing that made me look very, very closely at all of the lights in the paintings, the direction of the light, where the light fell on the ground, which side of the figures had shadows, which which side of the, even to the bosses on the back wall, parts of the architecture and so on, which way the light was hitting all these different spots. And what gradually became clear was that this light that immediately over Christ had nothing to do with Christ's own figure, but was falling very sharply from the right to the left, which, believe it or not, is rather out of the ordinary. Most paintings show light coming in from the left to the right. It has something to do with the fact that we're in the northern hemisphere. And this also made me realize that there were two sources of light in the painting. And by following his own indications, I was able to reconstruct precisely where this second point of light came from.
So her theory was that this mystical light source emanates from somewhere in there, isn't it?
That's right. It's between the second and third columns, and it's a bit higher than the height of the figures.
About 2/3 of the way up the column.
Yes, perhaps a little bit higher. I didn't notice.
You've got to get it at the right angle so that the cast shadows go up into the vault on the other side.
But in the model we made, the roof is all painted one colour, and you've got that differentiation in the colour that actually occurs in the painting there.
Dr. Levin has worked that out very thoroughly as to where the mystic light comes from and the shadows it casts. I think it's absolutely right. The point is that the mystic light comes from one side and the daylight comes from the other direction.
That's coming out about right. You're getting shadows actually from the figures also, which are catching up into the ceiling, so it's not quite as clean as it might be.
They don't actually cast shadows with this light, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Just
the divine light doesn't work quite like the natural light.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
It obeys its own particular rules.
That's right.
But the shadow's working very well in the back there. You've got a very nice angled shadow in the last vault.
That's about like the picture.
Last vault there, yeah.
With the idea of the light being reversed in this very noticeable fashion, it does lead you to believe that the flagellation image in itself, which is a totality underneath the portico, is an apparition of some sort, that it isn't really taking place in the same time as the figures in the foreground. The light leads you to believe that it is the response to something that the figures are thinking about, are talking about, are conversing about. And again, this is typical of Piero, that he would not really violate the traditional iconography by introducing extraneous things, but that he would use the elements of a normal setup of telling the story, but stretch it into something new and be able to express much more than the single dimension, shall we say, of a simple narrative. He overlays the narrative with another intellectual level. And in this case, my identification of the figures is a very individual identification. I don't know whether I believe it myself. But I do believe that what those figures are discussing and meditating on is the torture, the physical torture of Christ and other reflections of Christ's sacrifice in their own world. And that the issue of their conversation is consolation. Consolation for the loss of a child or a loved one. That is to say, how a human being deals with death.
My mind moved in front of it in quite a different way. What is represented on the left isn't simply a flagellation of Christ, as was supposed, but that it is the flagellation dreamt of by St. Jerome, in which he was condemned for reading pagan literature.
I had suggested that, in fact, the painting embodied a political message. In other words, it was an exhortation to the crusade, to Federico da Montefeltro. They tried to convince him to give money and soldiers for a crusade project. And the flagellation of Christ, which had been suggested, first of all, by Kenneth Clark, is a metaphor for the suffering of the Christians under the Turks.
I think Clark's view that it was about the tribulations of the church, because the Turks were attacking Constantinople, which they took in 53, and these people seem to be talking about it. This looks like, to me, a sort of angel who's telling them to get on with it. And this looks like a wealthy man who doesn't want to spend the money to raise a crusade. And he looks like a Greek who says, for God's sake, come to our assistance. In fact, they went talking about it for so long that nothing was done at all.
What art historians want to do is to iron out ambiguity, whereas what the artist is trying to do is something quite the opposite, which is presenting ambiguity. But the artists want to say, ah, that's what Piero meant, not what this other person says Piero means. Whereas, of course, Piero is much cleverer than that. He's dealing in both these things. So someone might say, well, this doesn't represent the flagellation of Christ at all. It represents this dream of St. Jerome, which is well documented in literature. But to say that means to attribute very low intelligence to Piero De La Francesca, who was a man who couldn't paint a flagellation without referring to the flagellation. Even if he is talking about this other flagellation, of course, one of the moral dimensions of the picture is it represents and refers to either the future or the past, flagellations to come, or flagellations that have been, and in one particular, the great flagellation. You know, this is part of the discourse of the time. And so he's carrying all this message into it. You can't pick one bit out and say, that's what he means, and then put it back in, and then somebody else picks out something else and say, that's what it means. You know, that's ironing things out. That's using art for your convenience as an art historian, not using art for its richness as itself.
I'm not really concerned with understanding of why it is the way it is, or who these people are. It seems to me if you explain it, it becomes less interesting. And even the characters within the paintings seem to me like an ensemble. It's as if he has a collection of actors who stand in and do it. So they're not. It's not an attempt at reality. You don't know where the reality of the thing is.
There are some paintings that ride high above all the speculations of art historians, all the speculations of social documentation. And it's those things that live today, and you think you can't work out why.